We begin with the biggest economic news in Nigeria this week with the 2023 fiscal appropriation bill signed by President Muhammadu Buhari on Tuesday, and a further breakdown with highlights of the 20.18 trillion naira budget by the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning and other top government officials Wednesday. This year's budget is coming just before the general election kickoff next month. The budget also comes amidst a heavy debt burden, low revenues in Africa's largest economy, and a looming global recession, if you believe the analysts. Joining me to discuss further is Mr. Tola Adeyemi, Regional Senior Partner and Chief Executive of KPMG Nigeria and West Africa. Welcome, sir. It's great to have you, and Happy New Year as well.
Thank you.
Yes, we've got something coming up, Arise TV and KPMG, a big budget day. Can you tell us, give our viewers, I guess, a teaser as to what to expect?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very much. As KPMG, we're all about insights. So what we seek to do in conjunction with Arise TV is to provide deep insights into the 2023 budget. We will do this by bringing together subject matter experts to dimension the various aspects of the budget and talk about the implications for business and individuals within Nigeria. I think this discussion is especially important within the context of 2023 being a transition year. So I really would strongly encourage everyone to tune in to watch this. It's going to be on Tuesday next week. That's the 10th of January, and it will be broadcast live from 11 a.m.
Fantastic stuff. Great to have that. We're very much looking forward to that. Let's get into one of what's going to be discussed there.
Okay.
Particularly this matter of President Buhari's letter to Parliament, the ways and means loans from the central bank, the talk about wanting to securitize. How do you see this playing out? You've seen the reactions. I want to get your reactions. As far as what should we be panicking? What does this mean for the country, the next administration, so on and so forth?
Rotas, it's very important to put this question of debt into perspective.
Yeah.
And the key thing to emphasize here is that our country has a revenue challenge. That no doubt about that. This revenue challenge is driven by factors that are both external as well as internal. So we know the external factors, the COVID-19 pandemic that everyone knows. This was not unique to Nigeria, and all countries had to resort to some form of extra budgetary measures, borrowing really, in order to finance this. We also have the lingering effects of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis. So those are external factors. Internally, we have issues related to our oil theft, frankly, and then we have issues of the petroleum subsidy as well, which are putting pressure on revenues. So there's a context to the debt that we have, in the sense that our current fiscal conditions almost necessitate the need to borrow, and that creates the debt. Now, having said that, there's no doubt that there's got to be proper governance around the debt. We've got to look at issues as to the appropriateness of the debt levels that we have, and that's where we look at things like debt to GDP ratios, where we say Nigeria appears to be okay, but we've also got to look at sustainability of the debt, and that's where you then look at things like debt service to revenue ratios. The securitization argument at the moment is addressing this issue of sustainability and looking to restructure the debt into longer term financing. It's like when you get an overdraft from a bank which you cannot pay back. One of the options available is to restructure it into longer term financing. So that's the real thrust of this. It's a measure to drive sustainability of the debt. But there's no doubt that we've got to look into questions around, as I said, governance of the debt. What are you using the debt for, as an example? And, as I said, the appropriate debt levels, the approvals around the debt, etc.
Thank you so much for that. Very in-depth there. What do you make of the parameters around the budget? Benchmark oil price, 73 per barrel. Oil production 1.6. You mentioned oil theft, and you know where things are right now. And the good old exchange rates. So I guess putting that into context with where macroeconomic conditions are, how do you see those parameters playing out?
Okay, when we look at the assumptions, I think here we recognize that there are levers that have got to work together. So on the one hand, you have the oil prices themselves. Some have argued that at $75 per barrel, which is the figure that has been that's in the approved budget, some have argued that that figure is somewhat conservative. But the way in which I look at it is that we've also got to look at oil production. We're coming from last year, where we closed at about $1.2 million per barrel, and budget projections this year of about 1.69, close to $1.7 million per barrel. That's going to require some tough decisions in order to achieve those levels of production. It's going to require facing the issue of oil theft head on and dealing with that. It's going to require addressing matters of insecurity. It's going to require encouraging investment in the oil sector by the oil majors. So when you look at it in balance, I think it's a budget that I would say, in terms of the parameters, they're not unreasonable, but there's some tough decisions that are going to be required to deliver on those budget numbers.
Thank you so much for that. The IMF, the ever-touchy subject of the IMF, yes. Made headlines this week, I guess, suggesting that the central bank should phase out financing, which kind of goes back to ways and means that you've already touched on. Yeah. But we've got some realities on ground with respect to where things are fiscally, and I guess the central bank's role in trying to finance different sectors. What do you make of the advice from the IMF?
Well, generally, I would say it's advice that's moving in the right direction. But you've highlighted the point that we have some fiscal realities at the moment which would necessitate borrowing. But, as we mentioned before, when you consider this issue of borrowing, the whole intention, when central banks lend to governments, they are, by definition, meant to be short-term lending. In other words, they're meant to be repaid. What we found ourselves in Nigeria is that we haven't been repaying those short-term extensions. And so we've got to address that, which is the securitization we've spoken about. So as a general policy thrust of saying reduce the lending from central banks, that's fine, but it's got to be taken within the context of several other measures. In other words, it's not one silver bullet that's going to solve the issues.
Right.
There are structural issues in the economy that have got to be addressed as you look at the need to reduce borrowing from the central bank.
All right. I want to ask you about, I guess, some allocations of the budget. Defense, for example, getting almost 3 trillion naira more than education and health. Not the case in other economies. Is that accurate? Or should that be changed? I know we're having security issues. What do you make of that?
The reality, again, Rotas, as I see this, is that these are all important aspects that government needs to prioritize. As you've rightly said, defense is important to prioritize that at the moment because of the insecurity that we have. And you know that insecurity cuts across all sectors of the economy. And if we don't address the security challenges, then we're almost setting ourselves up to fail. So it's right to prioritize spending that will effectively address insecurity. Of course, as we put money into it, we've got to make sure that we're getting the right outcomes as well. But at the same time, education and health are equally important. Now, when you talk about budgetary allocation for education and health, we must remember that these items are also on the concurrent and residual legislative lists, which means that there are allocations happening for these sectors at the state and local government levels as well. So in looking at the total allocations, you've got to add up everything. But having said that, there's also another reality, and that other reality is that no matter, because of the revenue challenges we have, no matter how much is allocated, really, government cannot do everything in these sectors. You've got to have private sector involvement coming into both education and health.
Yeah.
And this is where, again, it's about having a broad range of measures, including things around ease of doing business that will make it attractive for the private sector to participate alongside government in healthcare and education in Nigeria.
I'm glad you touched on the private sector. I'm glad you touched on revenues, because I want to ask you about taxes. And my word, we've had a lot of people weighing on taxes just this week alone, including Mr. Ben Akabweze of the Budget Director General of the Budget Office, who we had yesterday. The talk around multiple taxation and overburdened private sector, but then balanced with the fact that we need the money. Where do you fall? And you guys at KPMG, you've got lots of tax advisors. So where do you fall on the taxes?
When it comes to taxation, our view is that we've got to continue to focus on increasing the efficiency of tax administration in Nigeria. And we're going to do that by being smarter about the way in which we deploy technology in addressing tax matters. When we speak to many of our clients and players within the sector, one of the things that frustrates them is the difficulty they experience in even paying their taxes. We also, as you've mentioned, have the issue of multiple taxation coming from various levels. So there's no doubt that we need to simplify tax administration in Nigeria. But we've also got to broaden the tax base. We can't keep taxing and overtaxing the same entities. We've got to bring more people, more businesses into the tax net and really broaden that tax base. So these are the things that we see need to be addressed in the tax area. Again, it's not about one bullet that's going to deal with everything. You've got to look at, addressing some of the structural issues and inefficiencies in administration in order to really get the right level of taxes. Yeah.
Mr. Adeyemi, we'll leave it there. Regional Senior Partner, Chief Executive, KPMG Nigeria West Africa. We'll have to get into the informal sector and how to formalize them on budget day. So we'll get into that there. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.